What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect. In this video, I thought I'd just share a quick tip on how you can add some grungy texture to your live action shot with some simple alpha texture planes and a few compositing techniques. This effect is super simple and you can do it really quickly inside of Blender. Essentially, it's just experimenting with different blend modes in order to get the texture that you want to add to your environment to blend into your environment a bit easier without recreating the entire environment in CG. So anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender and I just have a basic shot here. I've just motion tracked this shot of this character doing some tire flipping. So pretty simple track. And again, I have a tutorial on 3D tracking inside of Blender. So I'll put a link to that in the description below in case you want to learn that process, but I'm not going to be covering it here specifically. But this technique will work on static photos or videos as well. You just need to make sure that the texture that you're going to be overlaying matches the general geometry of your scene and stays in place. So that's why we've tracked our shot here, and then as you can see, I've just kind of generally recreated this building on the left of the shot here. And then I've also added a ground to our scene as well in case we wanted to add some texture to the pavement here. I think for this specific shot, I'm just going to add some textures to this building off to the left of frame here. So maybe grunge it up a bit and add a few different elements to it and then blend it together in the compositor. So this is our shot. I'll just play through it here. You can see I've lined up the building generally to the geometry of our scene here. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started here. Now for the textures in this specific tutorial, I'm going to be using our texture stamps add-on here that we just released on Blender Market. However, you can use any textures that you like. As long as they have an alpha channel as the background, it should work in the same way. You just have to align it to the geometry in your scene. So feel free to use any textures of your choice, of course, but we're going to be using the collection from our texture stamps add-on here. So what I want to do for this example is maybe just add some rusty grunge that's kind of leaking on our building here. So I'm going to go to our concrete grunge dirt maps here, and we have a variety of rusty grunge textures to choose from. I'm going to use this one right here. And here I will select the object that I want to stamp our texture onto. So I'll select our building reconstruction object here. And now what I want to do is just add the decal to our scene here. So it'll automatically snap to the side of our building geometry. So probably something like this. And I'll go to render view. I'm rendering in cycles right now. You can see what's going on here. I'll just kind of line up our texture in our scene. I'm actually going to turn off our building reconstruction right now, just so we can line up the grunge to our scene. And with this add-on, it's automatically going to shrink wrap the texture around the object that you're applying the decal to. So it's pretty nice way to do this. But of course, you can also just use the images as planes function inside of Blender if you are using your own textures and line up your textures that way. But I want to just line this up right below the windows of our live action shot here. Something like this is not bad. And it might actually make sense for me to duplicate this texture and put some here and here as well. So I'll just press Shift D, duplicate this texture and put it here as well. And we can press S and then X, and I will flip it on the Z axis here so it's not exactly the same. So something like this could work pretty nicely. And we're just going to add some more grunge to this building here. In our compositing process, we'll see if this creates an alignment issue. You can see that the texture is kind of wrapping out this way. I think that'll be fine once we get into the compositor, but we shall see. I'm going to turn off our ground plane here for a second. So we have two different rusty grunge elements here. We might add a different one on this wall. Actually, I might use some of our moss textures here. This one might be interesting. So I'll add this to our scene. We'll add this one around here. Turn off our building. So there's some moss kind of coming down the side of our building here. That looks pretty good. I also might add some down here at the bottom level. So maybe I'll use some, I'll go back to concrete grunge. I kind of like this one right here. Then I'll turn our building back on, add this decal here, turn our building back off. I'll just kind of position this on the side of our building, kind of like there's some peeling paint or something. And it's just a matter of personal taste where you place these textures. Just try to do it in areas of your scene where it makes sense, because even if we composite together these textures seamlessly, if it doesn't make sense, a lot of the time the eyes pick up on these things. So it's not just about photorealism in the render, it's also about what makes sense for the scene. I think that's probably a nice place for it. Once we play around with the blend modes, it should add a nice touch of grunge to that wall there. Then I like this leaky wall here. So I'll turn back on our building, add this one to the side of our wall, add this kind of at the edge of our wall here. Okay, something like that. And I'll add something here as well. So maybe something a little more subtle, maybe. Maybe I'll just use this bit of grunge right here. Turn our building back on, and I'll add the decal right here. Turn it back off, and we'll just place this like so. All right, so that'll add a nice touch of grunge to this wall. It's a little more subtle than everything else. And I actually might duplicate this and add this up here as well, just for a little bit more. Have some fun with it. Doesn't have to be perfect yet. We can play around in our compositor and see what we need to change. And before we render this out, what I want to do is organize the collections a bit here. So here we have our building reconstruction. What I want to do with this, I want to add this to its own layer as well as the ground plane. So I'll select both of these. I'll press M. I'll call it geometry. And then I will select all of our decals that we've added to our scene here. And I'll press M, move them to a new collection as well. We'll call it decals. Okay. And now everything's a bit more organized. I also have the foreground here with our camera. Move the camera to the main collection. I will actually just delete this foreground collection. And yeah, now everything's a bit more organized. I'm also going to select the textures from our texture stamps add-on and just turn off the texture stamp edit mode here, just so it looks a little more organized. Now what I want to do is when we render this out, I'd want to render the decals only. So right now, as you can see here on this view layer, we're rendering out everything. But since we've moved the geometry of our scene, including the building reconstruction and the ground plane, to their own separate collection, I'm just going to enable them as a holdout, as well as an indirect only option for our textures here. So this looks pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to render this out and get into our compositing process to see how we can blend this into our environment. So in my render properties tab here, I'm just rendering this out at 32 samples. I've also enabled the denoise option, and make sure your film is in transparent mode as well so that you can render all of this with an alpha channel. I'll go ahead and save our project real quick. And now I'll go to render and render image, and let's get into the compositing process so we can blend all of this together into our scene. Alright guys, so here's our composite at first with Blender's default compositing node setup. And as you can see here, not looking very good, but let's get into the compositor and experiment with some things in order to get everything to blend a bit nicer. So I'll go ahead and close our window here, and then I will go to our compositing tab and make sure you have use node selected here. And this is the compositing node setup that Blender automatically creates for you when you do a camera track. This top bit is just our movie clip going into an alpha over node, and this is the render layer of our grunge here, and it's just being overlaid directly on top of our footage, which is going to our composite and viewer node. So the easiest way we can blend these grunge textures into our environment is just by using some different blend modes. So rather than using an alpha over node, I'm just going to press Shift A. We'll add a color mix node, add this right here, and I will move our grunge overlays to the bottom input of our mix node, and then I will take our mix node output to our composite as well as our viewer node. And I'll go ahead and delete our alpha over. And one thing we want to do to our mix node is make sure that the alpha is included. So go ahead and select that. Now, as you can see here, nothing has changed yet. That's because we're using the mix blend mode. But as you can see here in the drop-down menu, we have a variety to choose from. The ones I use most commonly to blend in things with live action are the multiply blend mode, the screen blend mode, the add blend mode, the overlay blend mode, and the soft light blend mode. And I'm not going to go into the math of how these blend modes work, but essentially each blend mode has different ways of using math to combine the values of each of our input images together. So I'm going to leave it at that for this specific tutorial, but perhaps I'll make a video more specifically in the future once I've memorized the operations of each blend mode better myself. So I'm going to go ahead and try the multiply blend mode here, and as you can see, our decals are already blending into our environment a bit better. They're a little bit too dark here, so what we could do before we experiment with some other blend modes is we could just press Shift A, add a RGB curves here, and just bring up, the levels a bit to try to match that input. Now, if you want more control over this process, you could of course render out each decal on its own separate view layer. So for example, you might like the way this grunge is being blended into the background, but not the second floor grunge. You could of course have a little bit more complete control, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to combine them all together on one view layer. So multiply could definitely work. You could also change the factor of how much everything is being blended. I don't recommend doing this with multiply. It just tends to look a little bit fake, but you might be able to find a way to make it work if you darken it down a bit and tweak the color a bit. But I'm going to leave it at 1 for now, and I might try out screen screens, probably not the best in this case. I'm going to try overlay. Overlay I've had a lot of success with generally when adding grunge to different environments. So overlay works pretty well. I think I'm going to stick with that for this tutorial. But yeah, you can see that things are blending in a bit better. And there are a little bit of, you can see that the seams are off here, so we need to adjust this back decal. But generally, this is blending in a bit better once we clean up the placement a bit. Overlay is very similar to soft light as well. So sometimes I use soft light and it blends it in a bit better. A little bit too much opacity here though. So I think overlay is the best bet for this specific example. However, feel free to play around with different blend modes here and then adjust the color accordingly. I'll just increase the levels a bit. Another thing we might need to do is just add a little bit of blur to these elements because they're a little bit sharp compared to our background. So what I'll do is I'll press Shift A, we'll add a filter, blur, add this right here. Then I'll just blur the decals by 2 pixels each. 2 pixels might be a little much, maybe just 1 pixel, just to take the edge off there. And yeah, that's looking a little bit nicer. And yeah, at this point, it's just a matter of color correcting your elements to overlay on top of your footage nicely. So we could add a color balance node here, push in a little bit of blue because our image is a little bit cooler here. It's also a little bit green, so I might push in a little bit of green into the mids, and already it's looking a little bit nicer. And I also might, just for the sake of this tutorial, add a little bit of color correction to our final image as well. So we'll just do a classic tritone of our image. And yeah, as you can see here, our decals are blending into our footage a lot nicer here, and you can use this technique to build up grunge or just add different overlays to any of your live action shots to create a little bit more of an interesting result. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to see next on the channel, and I'll see you next time.